these things.
All right. Well, we are live now on A Mighty Blaze. I just want to welcome everybody to the Friday Frontliner interview today. It's going to be so exciting. We're very, very fortunate to have Jess Walter here to talk about his new book, The Cold Millions. This book is just blowing up right now, and it only published this week, so we feel quite fortunate, actually, that Jess made some time for us today. But just a few words before we get started. As you know, or I hope you know, this is A Mighty Blaze, and what A Mighty Blaze is, it's an all-volunteer organization. A bunch of writers, folks in the publishing industry, we all got together at the beginning of COVID to try to help writers connect with readers in this very strange time. We had so many friends whose book tours got canceled, and Jess certainly is among them. And so we're just trying to bring a little bit of that book tour feel online for people, so readers can interact with writers. We've had some great people on this program just in the last few weeks: Erica Jong, Dean Koontz, John Irving, Cheryl Strayed, Edwidge Danticat, just to name a few. We do about 5 to 10 new interviews every week. So if you want to know how you can help A Mighty Blaze, which frankly is just helping writers, just like us and follow us on social media. That's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. So yeah, if you want to ask a question today, please just put it in the Facebook chat, and it will find its way to me. Ask your question at any time. I'll try to leave about 5 or 10 minutes at the end for that. I have a ton of questions because Jess is actually an extremely interesting guy, and like every time I hear him talk, I just become more relaxed. I think everybody will have a very positive experience just listening to this interview. So let's get to it. I want to give a brief intro of Jess. He is a former National Book Award finalist. He's the winner of the Edgar Allan Poe Award. He's the author of 7 novels, 1 book of short stories, and 1 book of nonfiction. His work has been translated into 32 languages, and his fiction has been selected 3 times for Best American Short Stories, as well as the Pushcart Prize and the Best American Non-Required Reading. He began his career in 1987 as a reporter for his hometown newspaper, The Spokesman Review. He was a finalist for the 1992 Pulitzer Prize as part of a team covering the shootout and standoff at Ruby Ridge in northern Idaho, which later became a nonfiction work of his. He's also worked as a screenwriter and has taught graduate creative writing at University of Iowa, Pacific University, Eastern Washington, and Pacific Lutheran. His previous novel, which I know because of all the text messages I've been getting in the last few days, Beautiful Ruins, was a smash hit. People feel very passionately about this book. It was released in 2012. It was a #1 New York Times bestseller. It spent more than a year on the bestseller list. It was Esquire's Book of the Year and NPR Fresh Air's Novel of the Year. So he's back now, 8 years later, with The Cold Millions. It was just released this week, as I said. The book has just been getting rave reviews. The USA Today, just to pick one, said it's a tremendous work, a vivid, propulsive historical novel with a politically explosive backdrop that reverberates through our own time. And I'll give you one more. Oprah magazine said Walter has taken inspiration from the great tradition of social novelists, including Dos Passos, Steinbeck, and Sinclair. That's some great company to be in. And I also just have to say, having like read through like a zillion Amazon and Goodreads reviews so far, there's like this weird thing that like about half the people are saying, which is like a very large number, they're saying, I love Beautiful Ruins so much, but this is even better. So I think since Beautiful Ruins sold like 10 zillion copies, I think, Jess, you're in pretty good shape. So Jess, with that big long intro, welcome to Friday Frontliner.
Thank you, Mark. That's so nice. And I'll take 10 zillion. I'll take 4 zillion, actually.
Just 4.
Yeah, but thanks so much for doing this, for giving authors and readers an outlet and a place to connect. And it's really needed in this time. So can't tell you much appreciate it.
Awesome. Yeah, awesome. Well, we're happy to have you here. So look, I've kind of been talking for a while about you and what your book is about, but I just want to kick it over to you now, Jess. Why don't you, first of all, could you just hold up the book just so people can see it?
I have one here. This is the
boom, there it is.
Actually, the advanced reader's copy, which is not quite as attractive. But,
there's going to be links in the chat to how to buy this book on Bookshop, and so please just make an impulse buy. Do yourself a favor. Don't even think twice. Just do it right now. But Jess, tell us what the book is about.
Yeah, The Cold Millions is set in 1909 in my hometown of Spokane, Washington, and I appreciate those reviews who sort of talk about the social novels of that period because I definitely was channeling that. It's about two young brothers, Gig and Rye Dolan, who get swept up in the early labor movement and in the free speech riots in my hometown, which were a real sort of ignored period in history that I wanted to bring back, and especially the character of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who is a 19-year-old suffragist and labor activist who goes west and leads really the first nonviolent protests, successful nonviolent protests in American history. And so the action kind of swirls around the social unrest that comes with these people fighting over trying to get basic rights for indigent workers, for hobos, tramps, and bums in the lexicon of the language of the novel. And it's as much a rollicking adventure story, hopefully, as it is a social novel. So yeah, and I'm so pleased people are liking it.
Oh my gosh, it's great. You know the vibe I got from this book was it had a very Bruce Springsteen vibe. I mean,
Yeah.
there's this kind of like anthem of the working man. There's just like such great humanity in the book, a lot of humor too. But I feel like if this book like made its way into Bruce Springsteen's hands, there'd be like a musical 2 years from now.
If you can get it to him, yeah, we'll have to do Nebraska 2 in a hotel room somewhere. Just him on guitar and me on harmonica.
All right. So, and just give us, just to clear up, like the historical fiction aspect of this.
Yeah.
So, like your two main characters are made up, but some of the people are real. Can you just explain that part of it?
You know, I first discovered this. I was a newspaper reporter, and one of the great places that most people don't have access to is an old school morgue, the old files of the newspaper. And I just remember I was probably looking up someone else named Flynn, and I remember coming across these stories of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and the real labor strife of 1909. And so when I went to build the story, I even toyed with writing a nonfiction book. I found the story so compelling, and for me, income inequality has been an issue that I have just struggled with, and that has seemed, to me to be one of the most undercovered things in our society. So connecting with that, I thought to do it justice, I didn't want to fictionalize the whole thing. So there are a handful of real characters, and I try to wind the fiction around what really happened to them. So Gig and Rye and the stories of betrayal and danger and undercover Pinkerton detectives, all of that is fictionalized, but it's not very far out of the realm. Dashiell Hammett famously was a Pinkerton detective who lived in Spokane for a while and tells stories about being offered money to murder Frank Little, who was an IWW organizer. So, and there were often Pinkerton detectives infiltrating these unions. And so even when I built the fiction around, the sort of big plot moves that I kind of loved in old historical novels, I left what happened to Elizabeth Gurley Flynn to a character like John Sullivan, who's the police chief of Spokane. I left those things sort of intact, as if this might be an alternate history. This might be what happened. I've done similar things in other novels. My last novel, Beautiful Ruins, Richard Burton was a character. And it was amazing to get Richard Burton's diaries and realize there was a 2-year gap right in the place where I'd written my novel. And that's almost what I imagine is that I could slide this into the real story. And while it isn't the real story, it wouldn't take you too far away from it. And that was the respect I tried to show Elizabeth Gurley Flynn and the industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies, who are the union that, the egalitarian union that takes anyone as a member, any profession, any race, women, at a time when unions were really only men, often only certain ethnicities. And so that to do justice to that, I tried to really craft the fiction around those true stories.
And Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, I have to confess, I hadn't heard of her before this book.
Yeah.
And like, the big question is, why had I not? This woman is just remarkable.
Yeah, she went on to be one of the founders of the ACLU. She was the chairwoman of the Communist Party USA. She was jailed. She worked against McCarthyism. She worked for civil rights. She lived this activist life. And I was really drawn to this period, 1909, in part because of the youth of these people. Rye Dolan in my novel is 16, almost 17. His brother Gig is 23. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn is 19 and pregnant, working away from her husband 10 years before she can vote, and still just, the courage of that character. And the last few years watching young people become so activated by the ridiculous hypocrisy in our culture, watching the young people in Parkland after the shootings there stand up and say that they want reasonable gun laws, watching young people walk out of schools and strike for the climate, watching Black Lives Matter activists, young people take to the streets. I really wanted to write about this, not so much the effectiveness of these things, but the raw idealism of being a 19 or 20-year-old who takes to the streets. And so to find a character in history like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who, no matter, she would go into these towns and the police would be against her, and the city would be against her, and even some of the other unions were against her, and she'd go into these rough labor camps. And the courage of that really inspired me. And
pregnant no less.
Yeah, pregnant 19-year-old. I always envisioned this as a sort of Western. I've never written a Western before, but as I was sort of, thinking, I want these archetypal characters. I want a civilization that sort of is sparked and begun with violence, with the degradation of the environment, of native tribes. And so having all of that work in, I realized this is one of those stranger comes to town Westerns. But my stranger is not Clint Eastwood. It's a pregnant 19-year-old demanding labor rights and that we emancipate the vagina, which is, real speeches that Elizabeth Gurley Flynn gave on these street corners in 1909. And the audacity of that character just pulled me in. You're not going to invent a better character than that. So it's a reason to resort to historical fiction.
That's a great pitch for the book, by the way. Like, stranger comes to town, but it's not Clint Eastwood. It's a pregnant 19-year-old. I
haven't had a chance to pitch it in Hollywood yet, but I'll remember that. They'll say,
they may be watching now.
Take your water and go.
Yeah. All right. So I have so many questions I want to get to. I just find the book, and I find kind of your views about your own craft so interesting. There's so much I want to get to, but let's just take a moment and just rewind here and talk about how this book came about. A couple things about it. It's been 8 years since your last book. I mean, people clearly have been waiting for you to release something. I'm just kind of curious about maybe how long it took. And then I also am curious about, some of the inspiration for it. I think, your father was a union guy, and I think your grandfather was just such an itinerant worker in this part of the country. So I'm just kind of curious, how did you find your way into this story?
Yeah, I guess I didn't realize 8 years was such a long time until one day I was out at my mailbox and my mailman is like, been a while since you've had a book. And I said, oh, it's been 4 years. And he said, James Patterson just had his third book this year. Sorry, but yeah, and then I'd be in the grocery store and people would say, it's been a while since you've had a book. So I don't recall those people when I was trying to publish my first book telling me, it's been, you're 31, where's your book? But I often work on 2 or 3 things at once. And this, I'd had this idea for a long time. I'd had the real story sort of stowed away. And it was very personal for me to write. I often write about class, and I write about the working class, especially, which I'm a proud member of. I'm the first male in my family in my direct line to graduate high school, first generation college student. And both of my grandfathers were itinerant workers for a while in the 1930s. My one grandfather was an Okie who had to leave during the Great Depression and work his way across the country as a teenager, ended up in the fields of California doing doing field work and was killed on a road crew that he was working on not long, just before I was born. My other grandfather was an agricultural worker who hopped a train in the Dakotas and ended up in Spokane. And when I realized I was going to be writing about these bums, tramps, and stiffs and hobos, that whole world, I thought back to the stories my grandfather would tell me. And while I knew we were working class. I knew that, even though he was a rancher, he had to drive a school bus to make a living at it. I also thought there was such dignity and adventure in these stories he told. And as a kid, my favorite book was Treasure Island. And every time when he would tell me about jumping on a train, it sounded so much to me like stowing away on a pirate ship, that I wanted to retain the romance of it in the book as well. So with that sort of, I often have 2 or 3 things that kind of crash together to make me want to dive into a book. And so the first piece was really that real historical story, and the connections I was making to a world now where income inequality is so out of control that billionaires make $1 trillion during a pandemic. And so that was the first thing. And then the second thing was that sense of adventure and the Western, and to bring that sort of rollicking sense. And the third thing that really made me want to write this was, frankly, the language of that period. I remember writing in my writing journal just the word bindlestiff. And a bindlestiff is a person who goes from town to town with that stick, that bindle over their back.
Yeah.
And the sound of that word, just the poetry of a word like bindlestiff, and characters walking around saying, "I've got the morbs," the morbs being a sort of morbid feeling of unease that the world's coming down around you. Like, who lives?
I think we've all got the morbs.
I know,
right
who
now.
lives in 2020, and why did we let go of a word like the morbs, and so the language of the period was the third thing. And so once I started kind of writing in that language and immersing myself in 1909 research, then I felt those other pieces coming together, that I could hopefully weld together the social novel and this big adventure story that I wanted to write.
Right on. And just on that note of the social novel, I mean, Steinbeck, Dos Passos. I mean, these are. You said you were channeling them. That's interesting. I kind of want to just hear a little bit more about that, and just kind of hear, like, I mean, can you just define what a social novel is? Is this like, is the intention for it to be activist in some way? Are you like trying to kind of play both the artistic game, but also play a political game of some kind and change people's minds about true political issues?
I mean, I think so much of writing takes place on those sorts of continuums. How much of this, how much of that. Real proletariat fiction, real socialist fiction, often can seem didactic, can sacrifice what we think of as verisimilitude, or what we think of as realism, to make a political point. And I so wanted to avoid that. And I think of myself, most of my books are fairly comic. And so even though this probably is the least comic in a way, I did not want it to be a dry, sober recitation of socialist thought. That's I don't think that, first of all, I don't think it convinces anyone. I don't think people are convinced by novels. But the best of the social novels isn't that. It's a work of empathy. It's a work of looking at characters and imagining their lives. And to me, there's nothing political or didactic about that. My favorite Steinbeck novel is not The Grapes of Wrath, which is probably the most famous social novel, because it takes those same Okies that my grandfather lived among and delves inside their lives and really makes a social point about the forces that brought that about. But my favorite of Steinbeck is actually Cannery Row and Sweet Thursday. These just 2 little novels that are more slice of life. And I think the poetry he brings to that, and the poetry he brings to the humor of those lives, is all you can really hope to do, even in a social novel. So while I felt like I was honoring those books, I also tried to have no political agenda except to tell this story, and to maybe make people think about, you know, the place the novel starts, which is very much a Gilded Age that I think is recognizable, and maybe the place the novel ends, the mid 1960s, and a time when labor had created an entire middle class which didn't exist in America before, and so to you know to to both give labor its credit, but also to see how the tide of change works, how revolutionaries like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn or Gig in the novel, how they may be the leading edge of this change, and it may not reach it for them, but it comes behind them. And so I suppose I had those sort of intentions which a social novelist has, but I was probably on my continuum, I push more toward the entertainment and just being swept away by a story. I mean, that's what I love when I read.
You know, I want to say two things in response to that. So number one is there's this great quote from Steinbeck, which I'm sure I'm misremembering, but I've turned it over in my head for so many years, where just this little anecdote about him where he's talking about this play that he had been writing or something, or a novella, some short piece. And somebody asked him, why didn't you publish that? He's like, oh, I just threw the whole thing away. And they said, why? And he said, because I despised everybody in it. And I think and the point he was making, it was about plutocrats, right? Yeah. And he was like, to himself, his own political agenda was so clear in that work that he realized it was just a terrible work of art for that reason.
It's really interesting. If you ask anyone what the great class novel in America is, it's The Great Gatsby. And and we tend to see class top down in America because it's about aspiration. We tend to think that a novel about, a poor person aspiring to a higher class, let's say The Talented Mr. Ripley, is a novel about class. But I think we can go from the bottom up. And the other thing is, I think social novels, I think the proletariat novel, the labor novel, I think that has sort of waned. But there are so many social novels. There are novels about the horrific effects of racism in America. There's so many great novels like that. You could make the argument that The Underground Railroad is a social novel. You could make the argument that environmental novels, the work of Lydia Millett, a novel like The Overstory, and because humanism is sort of the base of a novel, I find it fascinating when humans are causing all this terrible environmental degradation, to write a novel where you shift that over. You shift away from, what happens to the characters. So I don't think novelists have lost their sense of writing about injustice in any way. I think it's such a rich tradition. I think this style maybe went out of, maybe slipped out of style. And so by honoring, when you live in a place like I do, you're always about 4 years behind the style anyway. So in clothing and everything else. So, so I maybe am drawn to those kind of stories that other writers have drifted away from. Not every writer, but maybe some.
And then I just want to make one more point on that. Like you had said that you try to be entertaining and you try to be funny, and that's kind of like what you try. And I just want to reassure you that is true. There was actually like several quotes that I'd pulled out of the book, but in the interest of time, I won't read them. But there's like one that I thought in particular was hilarious. So there's this character, Ursula the Great, who is like this like ludicrous, larger than life vaudeville kind of performer. Yeah. And there's this one passage where like, I think she's talking to like her sister, and she's like, I've always had a weakness for handsome men. And my sister always told me, like, you're going to get in trouble, like, because of this weakness. And her answer is, well, let's just get on with it then.
Yeah, she has a weakness for beauty in men. And her sister said she has the lecherous eye of a man and that it will lead to her ruin. And she says, well, then let's get on with it.
Let's get on with it.
Yeah. That was such a fun character to write. And really, that was one of the reasons I wanted to write these big, as you say, larger than life characters, because the more research I did, they did not seem that much larger than life. There were madams and old vaudeville stars that I very much patterned that character after. And uh, you read a book like J. Anthony Lucas's Big Trouble, or a novel like E.L. Doctorow's Ragtime, both of which take place in this time, and you see there is a sort of this big American hopefulness in those early 1900s. And because the railroad was first connected everything, Houdini would show up in your town, or Babe Ruth would come to your ballpark and hit home runs, as he did in Spokane one time. And that sense of anything being able to happen was a fun thing to write into, and to write characters, write those big characters. Oh, we froze a little.
Pivot into Spokane and writing about it. I mean, I think an interesting from a craft perspective is it a blessing or a curse to be writing a novel about the town that you grew up in and presently live in? Because like on the one hand, it's like you go out to grab a coffee in the morning and it's like you might get an idea, like there's always kind of new ideas that could be pouring in. But on the other hand, you're sort of always on, like there's no break, like you're just, every time you're looking around, you're going to be thinking about this book that you're writing. What was that experience like? And is that something you'd recommend to other novelists?
I don't know that there's a single writing question that begins, is it a blessing or a curse, that you couldn't just answer yes. Of course. I tend to, I love leaving my hometown and I love coming home. And I've tended to do that with fiction. Like every other novel, The Zero was set in New York. Citizen Vince was set in Spokane in New York. Beautiful Ruins was in Italy, but every other novel I sort of find myself drifting back to Spokane, and that's a really complicated question for me, because when I was a young writer, I thought this was the last place literature could live. I thought it wasn't sophisticated enough, that I wasn't sophisticated enough, and I'm such a fan of writers of the South, and this idea that the South automatically imbues a kind of literary weight and atmospheric quality. It was after I had been to Italy and decided that I would write Beautiful Ruins and got stuck on that novel, that I came back to Spokane and saw it with a traveler's eyes instead of the eyes of someone who grew up there. And I think we all have to do this as writers. We do this with our family. We look, and I think that gives you an amazing advantage to be able to see a place from the inside, but then you also have to be able to look with traveler's eyes, look with the eyes of someone who doesn't take it for granted anymore. And I think that quality really allowed me to write about Spokane in my book of short stories, We Live in Water, in a couple of my other novels, and especially with this one, and especially the time I'm writing about. Spokane I'm talking to you from a 1907 house. This is the third house I've lived in that was built in the exact period of the novel. Most of Spokane was built then. You can still walk around, and I have a film on my website I think we'll link to, that is a short Ken Burnsian style documentary, 6 minutes, very short, that I made with a friend, in which we go to a lot of the locations, to the very house where a murder took place, and you can still look through the window. And so I think I was lucky in that way. I would hop on my bike and I would ride to some of these locations and sit with my journal. I would have breakfast every morning across from the old baseball field where I start the action. And so I very much was able to sort of soak in the place that I'm from. But again, I think I had to step back and be able to see it the way I see, another writer writing about New York, or another writer writing about the South, with that sense that this place has its own atmospheric qualities that maybe approach the level of character and of, and of theme, that there's a thematic connection to the place.
Yeah. There's one other quote I heard you say in a different interview, which was you said, I needed to know what the sound of 1909 was. And when I
Yeah.
knew that sound, then I could get into the work. And I mean, maybe that was like a threshold you sort of crossed in your research.
Yeah, I really was. And reading books from the times, reading, uh, I got an IWW songbook and just
Yeah.
reading the song lyrics, that the Wobblies sang, looking at the marks that hobos would leave outside of town, friendly lady, tell pitiful story, just,
Oh my
um,
God.
getting to know that whole culture. And I remember there was, reading one description that I give to Gig in the book, which was this simple thing. I assumed hobo, tramp, and bum were synonyms. They were all meant the same thing. And to read a traveling guy from that time saying that this is the distinction. A bum wanders and drinks, a tramp wanders and dreams, and a hobo wanders and works. And just those distinctions between characters struck me as, I want to paint this world. I want to write these two guys who are proud of the fact that even though they don't have a home, even though they sleep outside or in a boarding house or, wherever they can, they work. They're traveling by train looking for work. And so, once I think research frees you in a way. Once you feel like you know a place well enough, you can, then you can start to imagine. And that's sort of the key. People would ask me after Beautiful Ruins, how long did you live in Italy? And I would say 10 days. And I'm not sure if I was confessing or bragging, but one of the things that I love about my journalism background is I feel like I can research anything, and especially if I go there, I can immerse myself to the point that I feel like I can recreate it on the page, and that's the joyful part of it all.
Awesome. All right. So look, we have some questions coming in from the audience, but there's a few other things I wanted to get to before then. I want to pivot a little bit towards craft because, and I would just encourage anybody listening to this to go find other interviews with Jess where he talks about how he approaches writing and how he thinks about his own work, because it's just I think lucid maybe is the best word for it. It's so lucid the way that you describe your writing process, and I find it kind of for that reason just so refreshing. But just wanted to get into a few craft questions here. So one is, I think you said that it just struck me that you made a classic writer mistake of thinking you were at the finish line with this book when you weren't. And so can you just describe how did you make that mistake of thinking you were at the end, and B, how did you kind of rectify it?
Yeah, it's so funny to hear a word like lucid, which sounds exactly like the opposite that the thing feels. Those words like pow and bang, which
right.
Like lucid, it feels like the exact opposite of experiencing your own writing craft. It feels so haphazard and like you're stumbling around in the dark trying to put pants on and answer the phone at the same time you're pouring coffee, and that those false endings, those they're endemic to writing a novel, especially. And I keep these writing journals. I've probably got now 60 of them, and I record everything I'm doing. And I began to notice in there, when I went back and looked, the false finish, and it would be April 3rd, finished the 0 today. It's what a masterful work it is. April 4th, can't figure out chapter 9. April 9th.
But just to be clear, do you mean you have come to the end of the narrative and then you realize the narrative keeps going,
or you've come to the end? And I'm not really a draft writer. I used to have this terrible analogy. for a while I was a single dad, and I would have to comb my daughter's hair, and I would say it's like combing rats out of hair. I go back to the beginning and I just keep combing down, and someone finally said, that's torture, you need to comb from the bottom. I'm like, oh. So I go back to the beginning and I just keep going and trying to push those rats further down until I get to the end. And then when I get to the end, I go back and I start over. No, these are actual drafts that I finish, and then I think, I've crossed the finish line, and I've got 4 miles left to go. And often I think you have to have that feeling of completing it, and then you go to bed that night and you think, you really haven't connected these two sections, and this character doesn't quite feel right. I think the most profound version of that for me was Beautiful Ruins, which I finished in 2009, and it came out in 2012, because I just kept having to go back because I hadn't pulled everything together. I think the difference this time is I turned it in. I went to the race officials and said, I've finished, and they read it and said, no, you've got another mile to go. And my editor, Jennifer Barth at Harper, did a great job, sort of getting me to put my cleats back on and run and head back out. But almost, the notes she gave me, as soon as I heard them, I thought, that's right. Those are right. And like every writer, I will battle notes. And so I knew that I hadn't quite, that I just hadn't quite gotten there. And and I think but I also don't mind fooling myself into thinking I'm finished. I mean, I think it's almost a psychological necessity to think you've nailed this thing, all the way through reviews, all the way through, every part of it. You have to believe that you've done it, and then be able to go back in and tweak and change. And the thing I always find is I can think there's a huge problem with a short story or even a novel, and there are these small changes that make huge differences. And some of those small changes at the very end of this book, I moved 2 chapters around. I condensed 2 chapters in the beginning. I made it start faster. Simple things, but they made, for me, a big difference.
Yeah. All right, I want to get to a few more of my questions, then get to audience questions. You often hear interviewers say, like, we could talk for hours, but it's really true. Like, I'm like a third of the way through my questions. This is crazy.
I'm sorry, my answers are too long. It's my
All right, we got about 10 minutes left. I'm going to try to squeeze this in, but I think
6-word answers, I promise. 6 words.
Okay. So another thing I've heard you say is that one of the hardest, if not maybe the hardest thing for a writer to do is to keep faith in your work over a long period of time. And that, I think you said quite beautifully, you said that's a gift that I would wish I could give to other writers, is this kind of abiding faith that if you stick with the work long enough, it will work out. Can you just talk about that a little bit? I guess the specific question would be, how do you keep that faith? And is it something that you can give to other people?
I feel really guilty going out and talking about writing as someone who's had success, because any other point of the timeline, if someone had talked to me, there would have been that ache of, I can't get people to read me. I can't get editors to respond to my work. For 7 years, at one point, I sent out short stories and got nothing back but rejections. Back when you couldn't email them, you had to send them in manila envelopes. I used to call them manila boomerangs, because I would mail them out and they would come back, self-addressed stamped envelope. And so, you struggle with that all the time. And there were, much like the 15 years I spent on Beautiful Ruins, it wasn't 15 years of this is brilliant. It was 15 years of feeling like I hadn't gotten it, like I was failing. But the part that never failed me was the writing, sitting down, putting the sentences down. Every time I went back to that, I felt renewed, and I felt hopeful, and I felt the engagement on the page, that if I could get people to feel the things I was feeling as I was writing this, we would have something. And so if I could give, if I could go back and tell 28 38-year-old, 34-year-old, 39-year-old Jess, that it works out, that people do see the same thing on the page that you've created. That would be the most amazing gift. And if I could do that to other writers, I don't know if it's going to work out.
Yeah.
And I don't even know if it's going to work out on the next thing I write, or, you read a mixed review of your work, and immediately the floor caves in. We are all walking around on these flimsy floors of confidence, and the place where it always is restored for me is sitting down and writing, sitting down and putting the sentences in, and that's why I love keeping this writing journal, because every time I forget what restores me, I look and say, oh, and the next day I wrote. I got this rejection, and then I got up the next morning. You know what I did? I wrote. And
let me ask you, Jess, like, so you're somebody who spends a lot of time on your work, 15 years, 8 years, what have you. So what is the moment where you decide, oh, I am done now? Like, I've got this where I want it. I mean, how do you decide?
You find other writers to share it with, and then you weigh their contributions on the only scale you have, which is, what did I set out to do, and am I doing it? Sometimes I would ignore people's responses, but then when you start to get that feedback, and the first journal takes your story. My very first short story went to the journal Yawp. I was in issue number 2 of Yawp, YAWP, and I think there were 3. I think it folded right by the 3rd. But
the middle one.
I was at peak Yawp. I was in the golden era of Yawp, before it. You take those, you take real nourishment from people connecting, and people will show me letters where an agent says, this didn't speak to me, but keep sending me your work, and I tell them, agents are not lying to you. They don't want to be inundated. Or an editor who says, not for us, but keep sending more. And I remember the one rejection I got said, dear Mr. Walter, thank you for submitting this. You write pretty well, but as literature, I think not. And I remember looking at that and going, like, I write pretty well? Thank you. You take, like, I don't know. And then it's your own storytelling instincts you're trying to find, and you find that in the stuff you read. You find the books that speak to you, and the effects you're trying to recreate, not literary effects but emotional effects. You're trying, and I'll never forget reading a book like 100 Years of Solitude and thinking, if I can sweep someone away that completely, it turns out I can't, but
hey,
the feeling,
what?
But the feeling of it is is the thing you try to recreate.
Yeah. Well, I think you're sweeping plenty of people away, Jess. All right. So look, we got about 5 minutes left. I want to jump into some of these audience questions. So one is about Beautiful Ruins, about, that by any standard was just a stratospheric success. And the question is just sort of like, how did that feel to you? How did that affect you?
It was really interesting. So I was in New York, and my editor had come we'll have a little book party, and I don't really know that many people in New York, so I invited my nephew, and they announced it's on the bestseller list. And I remember the feeling. It was like I had won a beauty contest that I didn't remember entering, and it was really amazing. And I have to say, it's the great thing about writing is having other people moved by the thing that you've created. And I felt that from the very first short story I published in Yawp, and it feels like that times a lot more. And that's the really rewarding thing, is that that many other people saw the thing that you did and saw value. And it does, I don't know if at some point, there's diminishing returns on that, but I loved hearing from readers on Beautiful Ruins, and I loved that it connected with so many different kinds of readers. That was so rewarding.
Awesome. All right. Another question is, War and Peace has a big role in this book. And just basically the question is kind of, why is that? I mean, I definitely noticed that reading it. It's like, not only does it, are the characters talking about it, but it seems to also kind of be like a kind of lodestar for the book. And so can you just talk about why that is?
it's a kind of talisman
Yeah.
almost. Gig is of the two brothers. Gig is an autodidact, which I kind of am too. I have a college degree, but I don't have an MFA, and so I think of myself as self-taught. And one of the first things I thought about Gig, one of those great details, is that there was a great hobo library. If you saw another tramp, you would pull a book out of your bag and swap it. And he has come across War and Peace, but only 2/5 of it, only 2 of the 5. But he's still able to pronounce it the greatest work of literature, and that struck me so much like something I would have done as a 20-something, you know. And then the book, I think Rye ends up connecting to it because it's about, you know, the Napoleonic War sweeping through these characters' lives. But it's also, I think books are aspirational. For me, I first dreamed of being a writer in a library, and for me that was also a class dream. I wanted to know the things that people in those books knew. And one of the most emotional scenes for me in the book is when Rye, who's treated like a pariah because he's a hobo, is treated decently by a librarian when he goes to check out the rest of War and Peace. And then I think also the proximity to history. I love the idea that Rye is not the hero of his own life. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn is. He's the protagonist of the novel, but there's another hero. And that just felt like a Tolstoyan idea to try to write. I'm kind of a structuralist, and so there are 4 sections and an epilogue in this novel, just as there are in War and Peace. And it was something I read along as I wrote. And again, it's so much of writing is aspirational. So to read a great work as you're trying to write something, as embarrassing as it might be, I think it's great to always aspire.
And if I could follow up on that, there's one other thing that from another interview you said that I just really spoke to me, and I loved it. And I'm going to kind of ask you to just go back into this same question again, but it's related to what we're just talking about, which is that, you know, you were talking about how when you were young, you had these great ambitions to be a writer, and there's some anecdote where you like walked into a library or a bookstore and you thought, okay,
Yeah.
that's where my book's going to appear, like in the WA or whatever. And then you said, you know, like kind of nobody grows up dreaming that there'll be like a mid-list author, you know, who's like struggling to get a book deal and whatever. Everybody thinks they're going to be Hemingway. And I think like, so, and of course, you have had great success in your career, far greater than most. But you made some interesting comments that I just would like to hear you say again for the benefit of everybody listening, is just about like the way that you still struggle sort of like with separating the work of writing and the joy and suffering and everything that's involved in the actual writing, and then this other kind of ego-driven thing about like your stature in the world, and how those things are sort of, they struggle with each other and they don't always overlap and so on.
I think they're also both valuable. I was a middle school student, and I crouched in my school library, and there, right before Walter, was Vonnegut, and I took home Breakfast of Champions by Kurt Vonnegut because he was right next to where I imagined my books would go. And that was, as a 14-year-old, that was such a powerful thing to read, because it played with a genre I liked at the time, science fiction, but it also was, it brought in humor, and it was humanistic, and, you know, and the sorts of aphorisms that Vonnegut would write, you know, God damn it, just be kind to one another. That's, you know, that struck me as all that fiction could do. And so I think early on, your dreams of being a writer are connected very much with specific writers. You know, I wanted the icy cool of Joan Didion and a pair of great big sunglasses. You know, you want to embody those writers in that way. And so, you know, it can be jarring to realize you're still you know, and for me, the worry about, you know, I write about class in a way because it's also my deepest insecurity. The fear that I'll mispronounce a word I've only seen on the page. The fear that I'll be in a conversation with another writer and they'll talk about a writer I have not only not read, but not heard of because of my sketchy education. And so that aspiration, I think, is a huge part of it. You do aspire to write the kinds of work that you carried around because they profoundly influenced you, and yet you will disappoint yourself. You won't reach the levels of those writers, and I think keeping the aspiration without giving in to the disappointment is something that we all battle. For me, there's always a point where I feel like my humility and my confidence intersect, and they don't seem like they should. They seem like they're on opposite sides. But at some point I will be humbled, when I realize that the thing I've created is good. It's not, it may not last forever. It may not be taught in colleges and high schools. One of my own kids might think it's kind of stupid. But I wake up the next morning and I get to try again. I get to keep aspiring and keep trying to write something great, write something beyond my abilities. And when it's going well, I'll read something I wrote and I'll think that's better than I can imagine doing. And I live for those days, as rare as they might be.
Awesome. See, I told you, everybody, that when Jess talks about craft, it's going to be great.
That was not lucid. I think
it's lucid. This is like the definition of lucid.
In the word Inigo Montoya, I don't think that word means what you think it means.
Oh, what a great line. Okay, so we're going to, this is my last question. We're out of time, but I have a last question that I love to ask people, which is that, so let's go back specifically to the Cold Millions. Just imagine you have an ideal reader. This is the reader who is getting every joke, getting every reference. They are just kind of in the perfect frame of mind and the perfect even time in their life for this book to be hitting them. They have the ideal reaction to this work. So imagine that reader then closes the book, and just describe in a word or a phrase, what is the feeling that you leave this reader with?
Oh man, wow, you don't mess around with the last question, do you? Euphoria, let's see. Wow, I think I can only describe how I feel when I close a great book, which is that I don't want to leave the world, that I've been so immersed in it. But then when I do leave the world, I feel changed. I feel like I'm seeing through different eyes, and that I sometimes need at least one day before I start another book.
Yeah, that's awesome. Oh, well, that is beautiful. Folks, the book is called The Cold Millions. Jess, can you just hold it up one more time so people can see the cover? Awesome. It is quite a book. You can take it from me, or you can take it from everybody who is reviewing this book on Goodreads and Amazon right now, and just saying that they love this even more than Beautiful Ruins, which was such a phenomenal success. So Jess, thank you for being here on Frontliner Friday.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. All right, folks, next week we will be back. We have Nicole Krauss. Nicole, the fabulous Nicole Krauss, she has written a book called To Be a Man. It's a collection of short fiction. So we'll be here at 4 p.m. next Friday after everybody who's listening votes on Tuesday. Be sure you vote. We'll see you then.